3 months. 2 women, the exact same words. One of them got called a scab. The other heard applause, or nothing at all. That right there, that single, undeniable contradiction tells you everything you need to know about the state of the WNBA Players Association heading into the most consequential labor deadline the league has ever faced. And the wild part? The ownership groups didn't have to do a thing. They didn't have to plant a story, manufacture a scandal, or run a pressure campaign. They just had to sit back and watch a divided union dismantle its own credibility piece by piece in full public view with a digital record that doesn't forget and doesn't expire. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's documented, it's time-stamped, and it's the kind of accountability breakdown that the mainstream sports media has spent months carefully tiptoeing around, because unpacking it honestly means saying things out loud that make a lot of prominent voices look very, very bad. So let's say them. To understand what happened, you have to start with the battlefield Clark walked into, because calling it a negotiation undersells what was actually going on inside that room and inside that union. The WNBA and its players had been locked in a collective bargaining standoff for 16 months. 16 months of buildup, 16 months of hardening positions, 16 months of rhetoric escalating on both sides until the air inside the conversation had basically become combustible. Strike authorization wasn't a threat hanging in the background. It was active. It was on the table. Players had openly discussed canceling the season entirely, using the nuclear option as their primary piece of leverage in a fight they believed they couldn't afford to lose. And it wasn't a small fight. The $2.2 billion television deal, the largest broadcast contract in the history of the league, was sitting right there, waiting. This wasn't the old WNBA scraping for a regional cable deal and hoping someone noticed. This was a league that had finally broken through into mainstream commercial relevance, and that deal was the proof. That deal was the moment where the product had finally matched the promise. The veteran leadership's position was clear and it was firm. 27% of gross revenue or nothing. That was the line. That was where they'd planted their flag. And the message coming out of the union's most prominent voices was unified. Solidarity above all else. No compromise. Hold the line. Into that pressure cooker, with strike authorization active and the temperature rising by the day, Clark stepped in front of the cameras in December and did something nobody in the veteran establishment wanted her to do. She told the truth. Not a complicated truth, not a political truth that required spin or framing or careful hedging. A straightforward, financially grounded, logically airtight truth that anyone who had ever spent 5 minutes thinking seriously about labor economics could have arrived at on their own. She said the WNBA was standing at its biggest inflection point in the history of the sport. She said the moment was fragile. She said it could not survive a work stoppage without real damage to momentum, to casual fans, to the broadcast partners who'd just written a $2.2 billion check on the assumption that there would be a product to broadcast. And she made the case that the product had to be on the floor, that you cannot extract maximum value from a league that had gone dark. No games, no eyeballs. No eyeballs, no ad revenue. No ad revenue, no broadcast partners interested in renewing at a premium. No broadcast partners, no $2.2 billion leverage in the next CBA conversation. The math was linear. The math was obvious. And she said it anyway, calmly and directly, because it was true. She wasn't undercutting solidarity. She wasn't crossing a line. She was trying to stop the union from burning down the exact thing that was making all of their leverage possible in the first place. The veteran players chose not to hear it that way. What followed wasn't organic criticism. It wasn't a natural, messy disagreement within a coalition of players who simply saw the situation differently.
What followed was coordinated, it was sustained, and it was designed with a specific goal in mind: discredit the messenger before the message could take hold.
The attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, and they came fast. Prominent voices in the WNBA media ecosystem, commentators, analysts, former players, union-adjacent figures, built a narrative around Clark that was constructed to neutralize her rather than engage with her argument. The Nike endorsement became a weapon. The line was that her massive off-court income had clouded her judgment, that someone making what Clark was making from endorsements couldn't possibly see the labor situation clearly, that she was insulated from the financial reality facing players who didn't have her commercial profile, and therefore her perspective was invalid before it could even be considered. The blind to her teammates angle came next. The argument shifted from what she said to what she allegedly didn't understand, that the players at the lower end of the salary scale were suffering, that the gap between Clark's reality and a rookie on a minimum deal was so vast she couldn't speak to it. This one was clever because it had just enough surface plausibility to stick. Of course there's a salary gap. Of course the lived experience of a franchise-level star is different from a role player barely clearing league minimum. That's true. What it isn't, what it was never designed to be, is a logical rebuttal to the economic argument she'd made about what happens to the entire league if the season doesn't happen. And then came the word, scab. It got attached to her name and it circulated freely, in comment sections, in media coverage, in the spaces where the WNBA conversation happens online. Scab, a word with real labor movement weight, a word that carries history and meaning, applied to a player who had not crossed any picket line, had not broken any strike, had not done anything except publicly argue that a work stoppage would hurt the union's long-term position. The goal was transparent: kill the credibility, make anyone who agreed with Clark feel like they were agreeing with someone who was fundamentally against the players, against the movement, against the solidarity that the union had built its entire public posture around. Make the argument radioactive by making the person radioactive first. And for a while, for months in fact, it worked. Clark's comments got absorbed into the broader narrative of her as a divisive figure, as someone the veteran establishment had complicated feelings about for reasons that predated the CBA and ran deeper than any single public statement. The media machinery had successfully reframed a straightforward economic argument as a character issue, and character issues are much harder to defend against than economic ones. But here's the thing about the digital record: it doesn't expire. Paige Bueckers is not an outsider. That's the first thing you need to understand about why what happened next matters as much as it does. Clark's complicated relationship with the veteran establishment had context. She was new, she was from Iowa, she had arrived carrying a commercial profile that made some people in the league uncomfortable in ways that were never entirely about basketball. There was a cultural dimension to the resistance she faced that went beyond any single policy disagreement. Bueckers doesn't carry that baggage. She carries the Yukon pipeline. She carries Gino Auriemma's institutional stamp, the lineage that produced Diana Taurasi and Maya Moore and Breanna Stewart, the exact players the old guard points to when they want to define what WNBA excellence is supposed to look like. She comes from the right place, the right program, the right tradition. She is precisely the kind of player the veteran establishment endorses without hesitation. If there is a category of approved rookie voice, Paige Bueckers lives in it. So when she sat down weeks before the March 10th deadline to address the exact same CBA crisis that had gotten Clark branded a scab, the expectation, at least from the union's most vocal corners, should have been that she'd get in line with the official position. Say the things you're supposed to say, support the 27%, hold the line. She didn't. She said she doesn't want to strike. She said she loves playing basketball. She said the situation needs to be handled professionally. And then she said, clearly, directly, in language that left absolutely zero room for interpretation, that the product needs to be on the court. Read that again.
The product needs to be on the court. That is the same philosophy. That is the same macroeconomic logic. That is the same conclusion. The only variable, the only thing that changed between Clark saying it in December and Bueckers saying it weeks before the deadline was the name attached to it. And then everyone waited for the backlash. It didn't come. That's the part that broke the whole thing open, because the absence of a response is itself a response. The exact voices that had spent months methodically dismantling Clark's credibility, who had been loud, consistent, and organized in their criticism, went completely, conspicuously, impossibly silent. Where were the threads accusing Bueckers of being anti-union? Where were the media commentators demanding she check her privilege, suggesting her Yukon money or her endorsement deals were clouding her perspective on what lower-earning teammates actually needed from this negotiation? Where were the scab labels? Where was the coordinated campaign to make sure anyone who agreed with her understood they were agreeing with someone who stood against the players? They did not come. Not a whisper. Not a softened version of the critique. Not even a, well, we understand where she's coming from, but acknowledgement that created at least the appearance of consistency. The machine that had activated instantly in December stayed completely powered down in the weeks before the March deadline. The internet noticed within hours. Side-by-side screenshots of the two statements began circulating, Clark's December comments next to Bueckers' pre-deadline remarks, and the comparison was, as a matter of pure logic, impossible to argue with. Same words, same meaning, same economic framework, different name, wildly different response. That's when the thing the veteran establishment had carefully constructed over 16 months started to crack. Because if the criticism of Clark had actually been about the argument, if it had genuinely been about the economic reasoning, the implications for labor solidarity, the potential damage to players at the lower end of the salary scale, then Bueckers should have faced the same criticism. The argument doesn't change based on who's making it. If it was wrong in December coming from Clark, it was wrong in February coming from Bueckers. The logic either holds or it doesn't, and the person delivering it is irrelevant to whether it holds. But the criticism didn't come for Bueckers. It didn't even warm up. It flatlined. And what that revealed, what it couldn't help but reveal, is that the criticism of Clark was never actually about the argument. It was about Clark. It was about who was and wasn't allowed to say certain things within the political geography of this union, and Clark occupied the wrong position on that map. The WNBA Players Association didn't just lose the moral high ground in that moment. They exposed that the moral high ground had never been the actual point to begin with. Here's where this stops being just internal drama and starts being a genuine strategic disaster for the union, because the ownership groups were watching all of this happen too. Think about what they were seeing across the negotiating table while the Bueckers-Clark comparison was going viral. They were watching a union whose public messaging was demonstrably inconsistent, whose loudest voices had spent months crusading against a position that their own members now openly shared. They were watching a player base that was visibly not unified around the all-or-nothing hardline its leadership had staked the entire negotiation on. They were watching the credibility infrastructure of the union's public campaign collapse in real time on social media, in a way that any competent communications team could screenshot and archive. A divided union is a weakened union. That's not controversial labor theory. That is basic, foundational, first principle negotiation reality. When the other side can see the cracks, when they can point to documented evidence that your coalition is fracturing, when they can watch your own members undermine the narrative you spent 16 months building, they know they can wait. They know time is working for them, not against them.
And the owners could wait. They had no financial pressure driving them to the table the way a canceled season creates financial pressure on players who depend on their WNBA contracts. The power dynamic in a lockout or a strike situation has always been asymmetric. Ownership can survive a dark season in ways that players, especially those earning league minimum or close to it, simply cannot. Every day the standoff continued was a day the union's leverage eroded a little more. The owners had seen the receipts. They knew exactly what was playing out. and they sat comfortably. While the credibility collapse was unfolding publicly, a separate disaster was taking shape inside the actual negotiation room. Ownership had put a significant counterproposal on the table. The baseline salary offer they presented would deliver raises of roughly $200,000 annually for veteran role players, athletes who had previously been earning around $90,000 per year. That is more than double. In virtually any professional context, in virtually any industry, at any level of seniority, in any labor negotiation, you acknowledge that number, you finalize the remaining terms, and you sign. That's not a ceiling, that's a foundation. You take that win, you bank the progress, and you use the momentum for the next CBA conversation from a stronger position. You don't blow up the deal on principle when the principle costs your members the actual money they need right now. Veteran guard Natasha Cloud stepped in front of a microphone and explained with apparent conviction why that was not good enough. Her argument was this: the $200,000 figure looked different after taxes, and housing costs in a market like New York City, she explained, would reduce what players actually took home to something that didn't reflect the full value of the raise. That argument stopped the negotiations cold. And let's be precise about what that argument actually was, because precision matters here. Natasha Cloud presented standard adult financial obligations, federal income taxes, state income taxes, the cost of living in expensive cities, as if they were hidden structural flaws buried in the ownership group's proposal, as if the existence of the IRS was something the owners had slipped into the fine print to trick players into accepting less than they'd agreed to. As if the cost of renting an apartment in Manhattan was an unprecedented economic condition unique to professional basketball players that the league had a responsibility to address in the CBA. Every employed adult in this country pays income taxes. Not some adults, not just the ones who didn't negotiate hard enough or didn't have good agents. Every employed adult. The guy running a food truck in Detroit pays income taxes. The nurse working a double shift in Memphis pays income taxes. The teacher grading papers on a Saturday in Albuquerque pays income taxes. LeBron James pays property taxes on his Los Angeles estate. He does not go back to the Lakers front office and explain that the assessed value of his property represents a structural inadequacy in his max contract and demand renegotiation. Patrick Mahomes handles his own mortgage. Russell Wilson manages his own financial obligations. Professional athletes at every level, in every league, in every sport, across every generation of American professional sports, negotiate gross salaries, fulfill their legal tax obligations, and manage their own finances. The concept that a $200,000 annual raise is structurally inadequate because the federal government will take a portion of it is not a labor position the ownership groups were prepared to negotiate around. It is not a labor position that any labor group, in any sport, in any labor negotiation in the history of professional athletics has ever been asked to negotiate around. Because it can't be a labor position. If you accept the logic, if you allow the principle that post-tax income is the relevant figure for evaluating a salary offer, then no raise is ever enough because every raise gets taxed and you have created an infinite regress that has no resolution. The owners didn't need to respond to that argument. The argument responded to itself. What they needed to do, and what they did, was recognize it for what it was, a gift. A public statement by a prominent union voice that handed them exactly the narrative they needed to make the veteran leadership look strategically incoherent in the middle of the most important negotiation the league had ever conducted. The union had just made the owner's PR job easier.
Here's the reality that the people still holding out were staring down as the deadline approached. The players who understand what is actually at stake, the ones who have done the math, the ones who recognize that the league's negotiating value depends entirely on the league being a functional, visible, commercially relevant product, were ready to move. They were ready because they understood something the all-or-nothing contingent had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. Maximum leverage requires a functional product. You cannot extract 27% of gross revenue from a league that is bleeding casual fans, renegotiating broadcast deals, and watching corporate sponsors quietly begin the process of identifying exits. The veterans who had built their public credibility on a hardline posture had fewer moves available to them in March than they'd had in September. The Bueckers comparison had happened. The tax argument had happened. The digital receipts were out there, time-stamped and permanent, and any journalist with a search function could pull them up inside of 90 seconds. The owners sat comfortably. They had seen everything. They had watched a union spend 16 months constructing a public narrative only to watch it publicly contradict itself in the weeks before the final deadline. They had watched prominent veteran voices make economic arguments that wouldn't survive a basic fact check. And they had sat across the table from a player base that was clearly not as unified as its leadership had insisted it was. A divided union, as any labor economist will tell you, is a weakened union. That's not a conservative talking point. That's not ownership propaganda. That is the first thing they teach in every labor relations course at every university in the country, because it has been demonstrated across every industry, every negotiation, and every strike action in the history of organized labor. Unity is the asset. The moment unity fractures, the other side of the table gains leverage they didn't have to earn. The WNBA Players Association handed that leverage over willingly, in public, on video, with timestamps. Caitlin Clark said the product had to be on the floor. She said it in December, when the CBA crisis was at its most volatile, when strike authorization was active, when the union's most prominent voices were still constructing the all-or-nothing narrative they would spend the next several months defending. She said it calmly, directly, and with financial logic behind every word. And for saying it, the machine came for her. The scab label circulated. The coordinated campaign launched. The message got buried under months of character attacks designed to make sure the argument never got a fair hearing. Paige Bueckers said the same thing weeks before the March 10th deadline. She said she loves playing basketball, that she doesn't want to strike, that the product needs to be on the court. She said it from a position of institutional credibility the veteran establishment had spent years protecting. She said it, and the silence that followed was so complete it was almost deafening. The side-by-side comparison circulated within hours. The internet pulled the receipts, and the receipts said everything that union leadership had spent 16 months trying to make unsayable. The math was never complicated. The product on the floor is worth more than the product in a lockout. A $2.2 billion broadcast deal is a foundation to build on, not a ceiling to negotiate around. Solidarity is the asset, and unity is the leverage, but only if it's real, only if it's applied consistently, and only if it doesn't crack under the weight of its own contradictions the moment someone with the wrong name says the right thing. The question heading into the deadline wasn't really about the money anymore. It wasn't about gross revenue percentages or post-tax take-home adjustments or whether Manhattan rent constitutes a structural flaw in an ownership offer. The question was whether the people still holding out were going to let the clock expire, not because the deal was genuinely insufficient, but because accepting it would mean acknowledging, at least implicitly, that the rookie had been right from the beginning. And in labor movements, as in most human endeavors, that kind of pride is expensive. It costs more than taxes. It costs more than rent. It costs more than the gap between 27% and whatever number was actually on the table. What it costs, in the end, is the one thing a union cannot afford to lose: the credibility to speak with one voice and have people believe it. What's your read on the double standard? Did the veteran establishment apply completely different rules to Clark and Bueckers, or is there an angle here that hasn't been fully unpacked? Drop your take in the comments. And if this kind of analysis is what you've been looking for, the stories the mainstream sports media circles around without ever landing on, subscribe and hit the notification bell.
The next video goes inside what happens when the deadline passes with no deal, and which voices inside the union are already quietly repositioning themselves for the power shift that follows.